What if I told you that sometimes the tiniest little thing can break through the biggest wall of silence? It was a rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, and a young black waitress named Zara was wiping down the same corner table for the third time. She kept looking out the cafe window, watching the raindrops slide down like little tears. Zara had been working at Maple Street Cafe for 2 whole years now. Every single tip she earned went straight to helping her grandmother pay those scary medical bills that kept piling up. The breakfast crowd had already rushed out the door, and now it was just her, the quiet hum of the coffee machine and some soft jazz music playing in the background. That's when something caught her eye. Sitting over there was this well-dressed man in a fancy suit, but he looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from your heart, not your body. Right across from him sat a little boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. But here's the thing that made Zara's heart squeeze tight. That little boy wasn't making a single sound. Not one word. He just sat there, perfectly still, like he was carrying the weight of the whole world on those tiny shoulders. The man kept trying to talk to him, his voice getting more desperate with each word that got no answer back. Zara had seen a lot of people come and go through those cafe doors, but something about this father and son made her stop everything she was doing. She could feel it in her bones. These two needed more than just coffee and pancakes. They needed someone who cared. Zara approached their table with measured steps, her worn sneakers silent against the checkered linoleum. The coffee pot in her hand felt heavier than usual as she noticed the way the man's fingers drummed against the table, not impatient, but anxious. His wedding ring caught the light, though she'd already noticed there was no woman with them. "More coffee?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd learned to read the temperature of a room, and this one needed gentleness. The man looked up, and she saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Please," he said, then gestured toward the boy. "And maybe some hot chocolate for Caleb? Extra marshmallows if you have them." The little boy, Caleb, didn't acknowledge his name being spoken. He sat perfectly straight, his small hands folded in his lap, staring at a spot on the table as if it held the secrets of the universe. His clothes were expensive, she noticed. Designer jeans, a polo shirt that probably cost more than she made in tips all week. But clothes couldn't dress up the hollow look in his dark eyes. "Coming right up," Zara said, filling the man's cup. The rich aroma of Colombian blend mixed with something else in the air. Desperation, maybe. Fear. "I'm Zara, by the way. I work most mornings if you're planning to be regulars." "James," the man replied, and she caught the way his voice cracked slightly on his own name. "James Mitchell. And this is my son, Caleb." Caleb didn't respond, didn't even blink. As Zara walked back to prepare the hot chocolate, she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. There was something about the way James kept trying, asking Caleb about school, about wanting to go to the park later, about anything at all. Each question met the same silence, and each silence seemed to chip away at James a little more. She made the hot chocolate extra special, adding whipped cream in a perfect swirl and arranging the marshmallows in a smiley face. When she returned to their table, James was leaning forward, his voice barely audible. "The doctor said it might help if we found new places, new routines." He wasn't talking to Caleb anymore. He was talking to the air between them, as if speaking his hopes aloud might make them real. "Places where you feel safe, buddy. Where maybe you might want to talk again." Zara set the hot chocolate down in front of Caleb, making sure the smiley face was facing him. "There you go, sweetheart. Made it extra special, just for you." For just a moment, Caleb's eyes flickered up to meet hers. In that split second, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Not just sadness, but a kind of watchful intelligence, like he was studying her, trying to figure out if she was safe. Then his gaze dropped back to the table, and the moment was gone. "Thank you," James said, and the gratitude in his voice was almost overwhelming. He used to love hot chocolate. Before. He stopped himself, glancing at Caleb with an expression that looked like guilt mixed with grief. Zara nodded, understanding flooding through her without needing details. She'd seen enough heartbreak come through these doors to recognize trauma when it sat at table 6, wearing a 7-year-old's face. Over the next hour, she found excuses to check on them, refilling James's coffee, wiping down nearby tables, adjusting the music volume. Each time the scene remained the same. James trying every gentle approach he could think of, Caleb retreating further into himself with each attempt. Other customers came and went. The businessman who always ordered black coffee and complained about everything. The college students who camped out with laptops and nursed single lattes for hours. The elderly couple who shared a piece of pie every Tuesday and held hands across the table. But Zara's attention kept drifting back to table 6, where a father was slowly breaking apart, and a little boy was drowning in silence. Around 10:30, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face went pale. "Caleb, I have to take this call. It's about Mommy. Can you be a good boy and wait right here?" Caleb didn't respond, but James was already standing, pressing the phone to his ear as he stepped toward the front of the cafe. Zara could hear fragments of his conversation, something about court dates and custody evaluations and lawyers who cost more per hour than most people made in a week. That's when she noticed Caleb's hands. They were shaking. Not the normal fidgeting of a 7-year-old, but a fine tremor that spoke of deep, bone-level fear. His breathing had changed, too, becoming shallow and rapid. His eyes were fixed on his father's retreating figure with the kind of panic that comes from having been abandoned before. Zara moved without thinking, sliding into James's empty chair across from Caleb. She didn't try to make eye contact, didn't attempt conversation. Instead, she pulled out her order pad and began sketching. Nothing elaborate, just simple line drawings of the things she could see from where they sat. The espresso machine. The window with raindrops still racing down the glass. A cartoon version of the grumpy businessman at table 2. Caleb's breathing began to slow. After a few minutes, she felt rather than saw him lean slightly forward, watching her pencil move across the paper. She drew a little boy sitting at a table with a cup of hot chocolate. Then, without looking up, she slid the pad across to him along with her pencil. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, she heard the soft scratch of pencil on paper. When she finally looked, her heart nearly stopped. Caleb had drawn himself, but he was enormous in the picture. Not because he felt big, but because he'd drawn himself surrounded by towering figures that loomed over him like dark shadows. At the bottom of the page, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, he'd written a single word: scared. James returned just as Caleb was pushing the pad back toward Zara. He looked between them with confusion and hope warring in his expression. "Is everything okay?" Zara caught Caleb's eye for just a second and saw something that made her decision for her. She casually closed the pad and slipped it back into her apron pocket. "Everything's fine. We were just keeping each other company." But as James settled back into his chair, his phone buzzed again. This time, when he looked at it, his face went from pale to gray. "I'm sorry," he said, standing again. "This is my lawyer. I have to. Caleb, Daddy will be right back, okay?" The fear that flashed across Caleb's face was like watching someone flip a light switch. In an instant, he went from cautiously engaged to completely shut down. His small body went rigid, his hands clenched into fists in his lap, and that awful empty stare returned. But this time was different. This time, as James walked away with the phone pressed to his ear, Caleb began to rock slightly in his chair, back and forth, like he was trying to soothe himself through sheer repetition. And then, so softly that Zara had to strain to hear it, he began to hum. Not a song, exactly, but a low, wordless sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. It was the sound of a child trying to fill a silence too big and scary to bear alone. Zara felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. Whatever was happening in that phone call, whatever court battles and custody fights were tearing this family apart, this little boy was drowning in the middle of it all. She looked toward the front of the cafe, where James stood with his back to them, his free hand pressed against his forehead as he listened to whatever news his lawyer was delivering. His shoulders were set in a line of defeat that told her the conversation wasn't going well. That's when the businessman at table 2, the one who complained about everything, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was already reaching for his wallet, already muttering under his breath about slow service and wasted time. But as he passed table 6, something made him stop. Maybe it was the sight of Caleb rocking back and forth, or the sound of that heartbreaking little hum, or just the general wrongness of a 7-year-old sitting alone looking terrified. "What's wrong with that kid?" he demanded, loud enough that half the cafe turned to look. "Is he having some kind of fit? Someone should call someone." The humming stopped. Caleb went completely still, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from being the center of unwanted attention. Every muscle in his small body seemed to coil tight, like he was preparing to run, or hide, or simply disappear. Zara felt her protective instincts kick into overdrive, but before she could move, James appeared at her elbow. He'd obviously heard the commotion and abandoned his phone call, but the damage was already done. The businessman was still talking, gesturing at Caleb like he was a problem to be solved rather than a child in distress. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but that kid is disturbing other customers. Maybe you should take him somewhere else until you get him under control." The words hit James like physical blows. Zara watched his face cycle through embarrassment, anger, and finally a crushing kind of defeat. "He's not disturbing anyone," James said quietly. He's having a hard time right now." "Well, maybe get him some help then, instead of bringing him to public places where—" "He's 7 years old," James interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "He's a 7-year-old boy who's been through more trauma than most adults could handle. And if sitting quietly at a table bothers you, then maybe you're the one with the problem." The businessman's face flushed red. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. I'm a paying customer, and I have the right to enjoy my coffee without listening to—" That's when Caleb bolted. One second, he was sitting in his chair, and the next he was running toward the back of the cafe, past the restrooms, heading for the rear exit that led to the alley. James started after him immediately, but Caleb was small and fast and desperate, and he had a head start. Zara heard the back door slam just as James reached it, and when he yanked it open, they could both hear footsteps splashing through the puddles in the narrow alley behind the building. "Caleb!" James called, his voice breaking. "Caleb, come back!" But there was no answer, just the sound of rain hitting concrete and a father's heart breaking in real time. James turned back toward the dining room, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "I have to find him," he said to no one in particular. "I have to. God, what if something happens to him? What if he gets lost or hurt or—" "We'll find him," Zara said, already untying her apron. "He can't have gone far, and he's probably just scared, not trying to run away completely." But even as she said it, she was thinking about the drawing in her apron pocket. The word "scared," written in a 7-year-old's careful handwriting. The way Caleb had looked at his father's retreating figure like he was watching his whole world disappear. This wasn't just about a disrupted morning or an unpleasant customer. This was about a little boy whose world had already been shattered once, and who'd just watched it start to crack apart all over again. And somewhere out in the rain-soaked streets of downtown Atlanta, a traumatized child was running alone, carrying more fear than any 7-year-old should ever have to bear. The rain had turned vicious, hammering against the cafe windows like accusations. Zara pressed her face against the glass, searching the blurred streetscape for any sign of a small figure in a blue jacket. 20 minutes had passed since James had stormed out after his son, and the silence in the cafe felt different now. Not the comfortable quiet of early morning, but the hollow ache of something broken. "He'll find him," Mrs. Henderson said from behind the counter, but her voice carried the uncertainty they both felt. Zara's phone buzzed. "James. Can't find him. Police say 2 hours minimum before missing child report. He's out there somewhere." Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "Where have you looked?" "Everywhere. Park. School. His mother's office building. It's like he just vanished." The bell above the door chimed, and Zara's heart leaped. But it was just Mrs. Kowalski, shaking rain from her umbrella and muttering about the weather. The elderly woman took her usual seat by the window, ordering her black coffee and scanning the room with sharp eyes. "You look like death, honey," she said to Zara. "What's eating at you?" "Just a rough morning." Zara forced a smile, but her hands shook as she poured the coffee. The drawing in her pocket felt heavier with each passing minute. "Scared," written in crayon letters that seemed to burn through the fabric. Her phone buzzed again. James. Found his backpack by the river. Empty. The coffee cup slipped from Zara's hands, shattering against the floor in a spray of dark liquid and ceramic. Mrs. Kowalski jumped, and Mrs. Henderson hurried over with a towel. But Zara barely noticed. The river. Caleb's backpack by the river. And a 7-year-old boy who'd already lost faith in the world's safety. "I have to go," Zara said, untying her apron with shaking fingers. "Go where?" Mrs. Henderson caught her arm. "Zara, what's happening?" "The little boy who comes here with his father. He's missing. They found his backpack by the Chattahoochee." The words felt like glass in her throat. "I have to help look for him." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. The river? In this weather? But Zara was already grabbing her jacket, her mind racing through every conversation she'd had with Caleb. The way he'd drawn trees in his coloring book, always with thick roots. The way his eyes had lingered on the cafe's back exit, mapping escape routes. The way he'd touched the window when it rained, tracing paths through the water. She burst through the cafe's back door into the alley, rain immediately soaking through her jacket. The dumpster, the fire escape, the narrow passage between buildings. She'd seen him watching these spaces, cataloging hiding spots with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary. Her phone rang. James, his voice ragged. "Zara, the police are organizing a search party. But with this storm..." "Where exactly did you find the backpack?" "Riverside Park, near the old dock. But they've searched that whole area twice." Zara closed her eyes, trying to think like a scared child. Not where adults would look, but where a small boy might go when the world became too loud, too unpredictable. Somewhere that felt enclosed, protected. Somewhere. The storm drain. She'd seen Caleb watching the workers last week when they'd been clearing debris from the drainage system that ran beneath Riverside Park. He'd asked her about it later, in his silent way, pointing to a crude drawing of tunnels on his napkin, eyebrows raised in question. "James," she said into the phone, already running toward her car. "The storm drains under the park. Has anyone checked there?" A pause. "The police said they're flooded. Too dangerous." A 7-year-old wouldn't know that. Her car door slammed shut, engine turning over on the third try. "I'm heading there now." "Zara, wait!" But she'd already hung up, tires spinning against the wet asphalt as she pulled into traffic. The windshield wipers fought against the downpour, and she could barely see the road ahead. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every slow-moving car, an obstacle between her and a child who might be trapped underground as water levels rose. Riverside Park looked abandoned, yellow police tape fluttering in the wind like warning flags. She parked illegally and ran toward the cluster of official vehicles, her sneakers squelching in the muddy grass. James stood near the dock with two officers, his expensive suit ruined by rain and desperation. "The drainage entrance," she called out, pointing toward a concrete structure barely visible through the trees. "Has anyone actually gone down there?" One of the officers, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, shook her head. "Water's too high. We'd need specialized equipment, and by the time we get it here—" "I'm small enough," Zara interrupted. "I could fit through spaces you couldn't." "Ma'am, that's not how this works. We have protocols." "Your protocols are for normal missing children," James cut in, his voice sharp with panic. "My son isn't normal. He's traumatized, and when he gets scared, he hides in small spaces. Dark spaces. Places where adults can't follow." Zara was already moving toward the drainage entrance, flashlight app activated on her phone. The concrete opening was partially submerged, water flowing steadily into the underground tunnels. But there was still space at the top, maybe 18 inches of air between the water surface and the tunnel ceiling. "Caleb," she called into the darkness. Her voice echoed back, hollow and empty. "Miss, you cannot go in there," the officer was saying. But Zara barely heard her, because there, barely audible above the sound of rushing water, came a sound that made her heart stop. Crying. A child's desperate, muffled sobbing from somewhere deep in the tunnels. "He's down there," she said, already lowering herself into the water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. "I can hear him crying." "Zara, no!" James grabbed for her arm, but she was already moving into the tunnel, her phone's light cutting through the darkness. The water was deeper than she'd expected, reaching her chest as she half swam, half crawled through the narrow passage. The current tugged at her clothes, trying to pull her downstream, but she fought against it, following the sound of crying that grew louder with each foot forward. "Caleb!" she called out, her voice bouncing off the tunnel walls. "Caleb, it's Zara from the cafe. Can you hear me?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. The tunnel branched ahead of her, water flowing in different directions, left or right. She held her breath, listening. A small splash to the right. Then, so faint she almost missed it, a voice. "Scared." The same word from his drawing, but spoken aloud for the first time in months. Her heart nearly burst as she followed the sound, pushing against the current toward a wider chamber where the tunnel opened up. Her phone light swept across concrete walls covered in graffiti and debris. And there, Caleb sat on a narrow ledge, about 4 feet above the waterline, his back pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. His clothes were soaked, his lips blue with cold, but he was alive. "Hey, sweetheart," Zara said gently, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The water was still rising, and she could feel the current growing stronger. "I'm so glad I found you." Caleb's mouth opened and closed, like he was trying to remember how words worked. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, the man was loud, like before. "I know," Zara said, moving closer to the ledge. "I know he was loud, and that scared you. But you're safe now. We're going to get you out of here, okay?" "Can't." His voice broke. "Can't go back. They're always loud." The water reached her shoulders now, and she realized with growing panic that she might not be strong enough to carry him against the current. But she couldn't leave him here. Couldn't let this frightened child see another adult abandon him in his moment of greatest need. "Caleb, listen to me." She reached up, her fingertips just brushing the edge of his ledge. Remember what we talked about at the cafe? About brave things being scary? He nodded, tears streaming down his face. This is one of those times. I need you to be brave with me. Can you do that? Above them, she could hear voices echoing through the tunnel. James calling her name, the officers shouting instructions. Help was coming, but the water was rising faster than she'd anticipated. I'll try, Caleb whispered, and those two words contained more courage than Zara had ever heard in her life. She braced herself against the tunnel wall and reached up with both arms. Jump down to me. I'll catch you. For a moment, he hesitated, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The desire to trust, warring with everything that had taught him the world wasn't safe. The water lapped at her chin now, and she knew they had seconds, not minutes. Zara? Caleb's voice was small but clear. Will you stay with me? Even when we get out? Yes, she said without hesitation. I promise. Caleb closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and jumped. She caught him as the current tried to sweep them both downstream, his small arms wrapping around her neck with desperate strength. The water was over her head now, and she had to kick hard to keep them both afloat as she fought her way back toward the entrance. I got you, she gasped, her mouth barely above water. I got you, and I'm not letting go. Behind them, the tunnel filled completely with rushing water, erasing the ledge where Caleb had been sitting just moments before. Ahead of them, voices grew louder, James's voice rising above the others, calling his son's name with a desperation that echoed off the concrete walls. They broke through into daylight just as strong hands reached down to pull them from the water. James was there, and the officers, and Mrs. Henderson, who must have closed the cafe and driven over, all of them talking at once, wrapping them in blankets, checking for injuries. But through it all, Caleb held onto Zara with one hand and reached for his father with the other. And when James gathered them both into his arms, shaking with relief and fear and gratitude, Caleb spoke again. Not just the whispered words he'd managed underground, but clear, strong sentences that cut through the chaos around them. I was scared, but Zara came for me. She promised she'd stay. The rain began to slow, and in the sudden quiet that followed his words, Zara realized that everything had changed. Not just because a child had found his voice again, but because in that flooded tunnel, all three of them had learned something fundamental about love and rescue, and the promises that matter most. The real healing was just beginning. James stood frozen in the doorway of the emergency room, water still dripping from his soaked suit. His son's small hand clutched tightly in his own. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after the darkness of the storm, and the antiseptic smell made his stomach turn. But it was Caleb's voice that had shattered something fundamental inside him. Not just the silence that had lasted 8 months, but the walls James had built around his own heart. "Daddy, my arm hurts," Caleb whispered, and each word felt like a miracle James was afraid to touch. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, knelt down to Caleb's level. "What's your name, sweetie?" Caleb looked up at James, seeking permission, then back at the nurse. "Caleb Mitchell. I'm 7. His voice was small but clear, and James had to grip the reception desk to steady himself. While they waited for the doctor, James pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He needed to call someone, needed to share this moment, but realized with startling clarity that there was only one person who would truly understand. "Zara!" His voice cracked when she answered. "He's talking. He's really talking." Through the phone, he could hear her sharp intake of breath, then what sounded like crying. "Is he okay? Are you both okay?" His arm might be fractured, but Zara. James looked down at his son, who was quietly telling the receptionist about his favorite dinosaurs. "I can't believe this is real." "I'll be right there," she said without hesitation. "No, you don't have to." "James, Her voice was firm, the same tone she'd used in the tunnel when she'd promised Caleb she wouldn't leave. "I'm coming." The doctor, a young resident with gentle hands, examined Caleb's arm while asking him questions about school, about what he liked to do, treating him like any other child rather than a medical curiosity. Caleb answered each question, sometimes looking to James for encouragement, but speaking nonetheless. "Just a hairline fracture," the doctor announced after reviewing the X-rays. "We'll need to put it in a cast, but he'll heal completely." Kids are remarkably resilient. James wanted to tell her about resilience, about the 8 months of silence, about specialists and failed treatments, and the guilt that had been eating him alive. Instead, he just nodded and squeezed Caleb's good hand. "What color cast do you want?" the technician asked. "Blue," Caleb said immediately. "Like Zara's apron." When Zara arrived an hour later, her hair still damp from the rain and her eyes red from crying, she found them in the pediatric waiting area. Caleb was showing off his blue cast to another child, chattering about how he'd gotten it, and James was watching with an expression of wonder mixed with exhaustion. "Hey there, brave boy," Zara said, settling into the chair beside them. "That's quite a cast you've got." "The doctor said I can go back to school tomorrow," Caleb announced proudly. "And I can tell everyone about the flood." Zara met James's eyes over Caleb's head, and in that look was a shared understanding of what had really happened in that tunnel. It wasn't just about the flood, or even about Caleb finding his voice. It was about the moment when love had become louder than fear. The ride home was surreal. Caleb sat in his booster seat, pointing out landmarks and asking questions about everything they passed. "Why are those lights flashing? What's that building? Can we get ice cream tomorrow?" Normal, beautiful, 7-year-old chatter that James had thought he might never hear again. Zara had insisted on following them home, and now she stood in James's immaculate kitchen, looking oddly out of place among the granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. She'd changed into dry clothes at the hospital, scrubs a nurse had given her, and her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. "I should probably go," she said quietly, watching as James tucked Caleb into bed in the next room. "Let you both rest." But when James returned to the kitchen, she was still there, staring out the window at the city lights. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling insufficient. "I don't know how to. What you did tonight." Zara turned to face him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "I was so scared, James. When I saw that water rushing toward the tunnel, when I couldn't find you both. I've never been that terrified in my life. But you came anyway." "Of course I came." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't abandon people you—" She stopped herself, looking away. "People you— what?" The silence stretched between them, full of everything they hadn't said over these months of careful boundaries and professional distance. Finally, Zara looked back at him. "People you care about," she finished softly. James felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained for so long. "Zara, I need you to know something. These past months, watching you with Caleb, seeing how you made him feel safe, you gave me my son back. You never lost him," she said firmly. "He was just scared. Sometimes when the world gets too loud, the only safe thing to do is go quiet." "Is that what happened to you?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw her stiffen slightly. But then her shoulders relaxed, and she nodded. "When my mama died, I stopped talking for almost a year. I was 12. My grandmother didn't push me, just sat with me, made my favorite foods, read to me. She understood that sometimes healing happens in silence first. How did you know what to do for Caleb?" "Because somebody did it for me." Zara's voice was gentle. "And because I could see how much you love him, even when you were too scared to show it the right way." James felt the weight of months of failure pressing against his chest. I was so afraid of saying the wrong thing, of making it worse. So I just threw money at the problem. Specialists, treatments, anything that might fix him. But you just gave him pancakes and patience. That's all any of us really need, Zara said. To know that someone will show up consistently without trying to change us or fix us. Just be present. They stood in comfortable silence, the significance of the evening settling around them like dust after a storm. In the distance, they could hear Caleb talking quietly to himself in his room, probably telling his stuffed dinosaurs about his adventure. "What happens now?" James asked. Zara considered the question carefully. Now, Caleb heals. His arm and his voice. Now, you stop being afraid of being his father instead of his CEO. And us? She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her wrestling with something. James, I need you to understand something. What happened tonight? What's been happening these months at the cafe? It can't be about gratitude or some kind of rescue fantasy. That's not what this is, isn't it? Her voice was gentle but challenging. You're used to buying solutions, hiring people to solve your problems. I'm not another specialist you can pay to make your life work. James felt heat rise in his cheeks, partly because her words stung, and partly because there was truth in them. You think I see you as an employee? I think you see me as someone who fixed your son, and you're grateful. But gratitude isn't the same as really seeing someone. Zara picked up her jacket from the counter. I should go. We all need some time to process what happened tonight. Zara, wait. See. She paused in the doorway, and James struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like exactly what she'd just accused him of. I don't know what this is, he said finally. I don't know how to separate my gratitude from whatever else I'm feeling. But I know that when I thought I might lose you both tonight, when I saw that water. He stopped, running his hands through his still damp hair. I've spent 2 years trying to control everything, trying to manage and fix and solve. Tonight, I couldn't control anything. I could only choose who to run toward. Zara's expression softened slightly. And who did you run toward? Both of you. Without thinking, without hesitation. Both of you. She studied his face in the kitchen's warm light, and he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his ruined suit or the night's chaos. I need time, she said finally, not to decide how I feel about you. I think I already know that. But to figure out if what we're building can survive outside of crisis, outside of the safe space of the cafe. Real life is messier than chocolate chip pancakes and foam art. James nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. How much time? I don't know. Maybe we start by seeing how this new version of Caleb changes things. See if you can learn to be his father, without being afraid. She smiled sadly. See if I can learn to let someone care about me, without waiting for them to leave when it gets complicated. After she left, James sat in his darkened living room, listening to the sounds of the city settling into late-night quiet. From down the hall, he could hear Caleb's soft breathing, peaceful and untroubled. For the first time in months, his son would sleep without nightmares. But James found himself wide awake, replaying not just Caleb's first words, but the conversation with Zara. She was right about the gratitude, about his tendency to treat relationships like business transactions. But she was wrong about one thing. He'd been seeing her, really seeing her, long before tonight's rescue. He'd seen her in the way she instinctively made room for people's pain without trying to fix it. He'd seen her in the careful attention she paid to what people needed versus what they asked for. He'd seen her in her fierce protectiveness of anyone she considered her responsibility. Tonight, in that flooded tunnel, he'd also seen her fear. Not just fear for their safety, but deeper terror, the fear of losing people she'd allowed herself to care about. And in that shared fear, he'd recognized something fundamental. They were both people who'd learned to love carefully, defensively, ready to be disappointed. The next morning, James called his office and canceled all his meetings. Instead, he made breakfast for Caleb. Actual breakfast. Not just the usual granola bar handed off by the nanny. His son sat at the kitchen island, carefully avoiding getting his cast wet, chattering about dreams and plans and asking when they could see Zara again. "Can we go to the cafe after my doctor's appointment?" Caleb asked around a mouthful of scrambled eggs. "If you want to," James said, surprised by how much he wanted it too. "I want to show everyone my cast. And I want to tell Zara about the dream I had." "What dream?" Caleb's face became serious, the way children's faces do when they're about to share something important. "I dreamed that the water was gone, and we were all sitting at our table, and you and Zara were holding hands, and Mrs. Henderson was there too, and she was proud of us." James felt his throat tighten. "That sounds like a good dream. Do you think it could be real? Not the water part, but the other parts?" Looking at his son's hopeful face, James realized that Caleb had been watching and understanding far more than anyone had given him credit for. The silence hadn't been about not knowing what to say. It had been about knowing exactly what the adults in his life needed to hear, but being too young and too hurt to carry that responsibility. "I think," James said carefully, "that some dreams are worth working toward." That afternoon, after the doctor confirmed that Caleb's cast was properly set and healing well, they walked to Maple Street Cafe together. It felt different now, not like a routine or a therapy session, but like coming home. Zara looked up when they entered, and James saw relief flood her face at the sight of them both safe and whole in daylight. She'd tied her hair back with a blue bandana that matched Caleb's cast, and she wore the same gentle smile that had first made James trust her. "Well, look who's here," she said, coming around the counter. "How are you feeling, brave boy?" "Good," Caleb said, then surprised them both by wrapping his good arm around her waist in a fierce hug. "I missed you." Over his head, Zara met James's eyes, and in that look was a question and an answer and a new beginning all at once. Whatever happened between them as adults, whatever time and careful consideration would bring, this much was certain. They were family now, the three of them, bound by crisis and choice and love that had learned to speak louder than fear. The real healing had indeed just begun. 6 months later, Zara stood behind the counter of what was now officially called Safe Harbor Cafe, watching the morning light stream through windows that James had replaced with larger ones to let in more warmth. The corner table where their story had begun was still there, but it was no longer the only sanctuary in the room. Every table had become a place where families could find their way back to each other. Caleb sat at that original table now, his cast long gone, carefully arranging crayons for the art therapy session that would begin in an hour. His voice, once so precious because of its rarity, now filled the cafe with easy chatter as he helped other children who struggled with their own silences. The transformation in him was remarkable not just because he spoke, but because of how he chose to use his words. Always gentle, always patient, always remembering what it felt like to have so much to say, and no safe place to say it. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter is coming today," Caleb told Zara, as she brought him his usual hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. "She's 8, and she hasn't talked since her parents got divorced. I made her a special picture." Zara glanced at the drawing. A child standing in a garden with the sun breaking through storm clouds. Somehow, at 7 years old, Caleb had learned to translate healing into images that other wounded children could understand. Doctor. Sarah Chen, the family therapist James had hired to run the weekly sessions, often marveled at Caleb's intuitive ability to connect with kids who had experienced trauma. The cafe had become something neither Zara nor James had initially envisioned. What started as James's desperate attempt to buy his way into his son's healing had evolved into a community center where families could rebuild their foundations. Mrs. Henderson, who had sold the place to James for far less than it was worth because she believed in what they were trying to create, still came by every morning for coffee and to watch what she called miracles in progress. James emerged from the back office, no longer the frantic businessman who had first stumbled through their doors. His suits were still expensive, but he wore them differently now, less like armor, more like the uniform of someone who had learned that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. He had restructured his entire company, hiring a management team that allowed him to work from the cafe 3 days a week and be present for every breakthrough, every setback, every small victory in Caleb's continued healing. "The Martinez family just confirmed for this afternoon's session," James said, settling into the chair across from Caleb. "Their son hasn't spoken since the accident." Caleb looked up from his drawing, his expression serious in the way children become when they understand something adults struggle to grasp. "I'll save the blue crayon for him. Blue is good for sad feelings." Zara felt that familiar tightness in her chest. Not the anxiety that used to plague her when she worried about making rent or caring for her grandmother, but the overwhelming recognition of how much could change when people chose to see each other's pain instead of looking away. Her grandmother had passed peacefully 2 months ago, finally free from the medical bills that had driven Zara to work double shifts. But instead of relief, Zara had found purpose. The cafe gave her something she had never expected, the ability to create the kind of safe space she had always needed but never found. Dr. Chen arrived early, as she always did, carrying her bag of therapeutic tools and wearing the kind of smile that immediately put anxious parents at ease. She had been working with trauma in children for 15 years, but she had told James and Zara that the cafe environment produced faster healing than any clinical setting she had ever used. "There's something about being in a place where people choose to be," she had explained, rather than being sent somewhere because they're broken. As the morning progressed, families began to arrive. The Pattersons came first, a mother who looked like she hadn't slept properly in months, leading a little girl who clutched a stuffed elephant and kept her eyes fixed on the ground. Mrs. Patterson had been coming to the support group for parents that met on Thursday evenings, learning how to navigate her daughter Emma's selective mutism while processing her own guilt about the divorce. Zara watched Caleb approach Emma with the careful slowness of someone who remembered being approached wrong too many times. He didn't try to get her to talk or even look at him. Instead, he simply sat at her table and began coloring, occasionally sliding crayons in her direction without expectation. The cafe had developed its own rhythm: morning coffee service for the regular neighborhood customers, followed by therapeutic sessions in the afternoon, then family dinner hours where parents and children could practice new communication skills in a low-pressure environment. Evenings brought support groups, one for single parents, another for children of divorce, and a third for anyone struggling with family trauma. James had initially worried about the business model, but the cafe was not only breaking even, it was thriving. Word had spread through Atlanta about the little place where families went to heal, and they had a waiting list for the therapeutic programs. Several other cities had reached out about replicating the model, though James and Zara had decided to perfect their approach before expanding. Around noon, Zara noticed a familiar figure standing outside the window. A man in a business suit, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing angrily as he spoke. For a moment, she felt her body tense with the memory of that day 6 months ago when a similar scene had nearly shattered the fragile trust they had built with Caleb. But then she saw how Caleb glanced at the man, shrugged slightly, and returned to his conversation with Emma, completely unbothered by the external chaos. That, Zara realized, was perhaps the greatest measure of their success. Caleb no longer needed the world to be quiet for him to feel safe speaking. He had internalized the sanctuary they had built together, and it traveled with him now. James noticed her observation and followed her gaze to the window. "Remember when that would have sent him under the table? Remember when you would have been that guy on the phone?" Zara replied, and they shared the kind of laugh that comes from surviving something terrible together. The afternoon session began with Dr. Chen gathering the children in a circle, while parents sat at nearby tables, close enough to observe but far enough away to let their children have their own space. Emma had progressed from silent coloring to whispering responses to Caleb's questions. The Martinez boy, Diego, was working with clay, slowly building what looked like a house with windows and doors that actually opened. "Healing isn't linear," Dr. Chen often reminded the parents. "Some days they'll talk your ear off, and some days they'll retreat again. The goal isn't to never be afraid. It's to know that fear doesn't have to mean silence." 2. As the session continued, Zara found herself watching James watch Caleb. There was still worry in James's attention. There probably always would be. But it was no longer the desperate surveillance of someone afraid his child might disappear. It was the protective awareness of a parent who had learned the difference between hovering and being present. During the afternoon break, Emma surprised everyone by walking up to the counter where Zara was preparing snacks. "Excuse me," Emma said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Can I have some apple juice?" The entire cafe seemed to pause. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes. Emma had not spoken directly to an adult outside her immediate family in 8 months. Zara crouched down to Emma's eye level, remembering how Caleb had needed that same careful attention to feel heard. "Of course, sweetie. Would you like ice with that?" Emma nodded, then added, "Caleb said you make good foam art. Can you make a heart in my apple juice?" "I think apple juice foam art might be a new challenge for me," Zara said seriously, "but I'm willing to try if you're willing to help me practice." As Zara worked to create something that resembled a heart in the surface of Emma's juice, she felt the familiar sense of witnessing magic in ordinary moments. This was what the cafe had become, a place where small impossibilities happened daily, where children who had lost their voices found them again, where families learned that healing was not about forgetting trauma, but about creating new stories strong enough to hold both the pain and the recovery. The evening wound down with families heading home, Dr. Chen documenting progress notes, and Caleb helping Zara clean up the art supplies. James worked at his laptop in the corner, taking calls from his business partner who had learned to respect the boundaries James had established around his cafe days. "Dad," Caleb said as they prepared to close, "can Emma come to our house for dinner this weekend? I want to show her my room, and I think her mom needs to talk to you about the scared parent stuff." James looked at his son, this child who had not only found his voice, but had learned to use it to build bridges for other people, and felt the same overwhelming gratitude that hit him at unexpected moments. "I think that sounds perfect, buddy. But let's ask Zara if she wants to come too. Emma might feel more comfortable with her there." Zara looked up from wiping down tables, surprised by the invitation, but not by the warmth that spread through her chest at being included. Somewhere along the way, the three of them had stopped being a rescue mission and had become something more solid. A family built not on blood or law, but on the choice to keep showing up for each other. "I'd love that," she said. "I'll bring groceries, and we can let the kids cook with us. Emma seems like she might have opinions about how to make pancakes." As they locked up the cafe that night, Zara realized that the dream she had written on the napkin that first day, the hope that Caleb would speak again, had been too small. What had actually happened was bigger than any of them had dared to imagine. They had not just solved one child's silence. They had created a place where silence was allowed but never required, where families could practice being whole again, where the ordinary act of sharing a meal or drawing a picture could become a pathway back to trust. The rain that had witnessed their first meeting had given way to clear skies, and as they walked to their cars, Caleb, between James and Zara, his voice carried easily in the evening air as he planned tomorrow's art projects and wondered aloud whether Diego might be ready to try speaking to the group next week. Behind them, Safe Harbor Cafe sat ready for another day of small miracles, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. A beacon for anyone who needed to remember that healing was possible, that families could be rebuilt from the ground up, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine was simply knowing that someone would wait patiently for you to find your voice again.